Can you pretend to be my husband for one day? The obese girl with no clothes begged. On a freezing frontier street, a girl wrapped in nothing but a dirty cloth falls to her knees before a towering mountain man. The townsfolk laugh, the sheriff's keys jingle, and the church bell tolls like judgment. She begs him for one impossible thing: to pretend he's her husband, if only for a single day. But when he places his coat over her shoulders, everything changes. Suddenly, he's trapped in her debts, hunted by lies, and facing a powerful enemy who wants his land. And she's shamed. Cast aside may hold a secret deed that could save them both, or destroy them forever. As the jail doors slam and snow begins to fall, what will happen when a single day of pretend love becomes the fight of their lives? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The cold mountain wind whipped around Mary Beth Collins as she clutched the torn flour sack closer to her trembling body. Mud squelched between her bare toes, and shame burned hotter than fever in her cheeks. All around her, the townsfolk's laughter cut deeper than the autumn chill. "Ain't that a sight?" someone called out. Old Collins finally showed us what his stepdaughter's been hiding under them baggy dresses. Mary Beth's vision blurred with tears as she stumbled forward, trying to keep the makeshift covering from slipping. Her stepfather's cruel voice still rang in her ears from moments before, when he'd torn away her clothes and shoved her into the street. "Let's see if any man'll want you now, you ungrateful cow." The preacher's wife, Mrs. Whitaker, stood on the boardwalk outside the general store, her thin lips pressed together in disapproval. "Sheriff ought to arrest her for indecency," she whispered loudly to her companion. "It's a scandal, is what it is." Mary Beth's foot slipped in the mud, and she struggled to keep her balance. The flour sack was coming apart in her desperate grip, threads unraveling like her dignity. She'd never felt so alone, so utterly forsaken. Even the God she'd always trusted seemed distant now, hidden behind the dark clouds gathering overhead. A sudden hush fell over the crowd. Through her tears, Mary Beth saw a tall figure emerge from the blacksmith's shop. Tiago Boone stepped into the street, his broad chest bare and gleaming with sweat from his work at the forge. His dark eyes took in the scene, hardening as understanding dawned. The crowd drew back slightly. Everyone knew Boone's reputation, a solitary mountain man who preferred the company of wilderness to people, who could track a wolf through a blizzard and fell a tree single-handed. He wasn't someone to cross. Mary Beth stumbled again, this time falling forward. Her knees struck the mud right at Boone's feet. The flour sack slipped dangerously, and she clutched at it with trembling hands. Looking up at the mountain man's weathered face, she saw something there, not pity, but a flash of protective anger that gave her courage born of desperation. "Please," she whispered, reaching out to grasp his forearm. His skin was warm despite the cold air. "Can you pretend to be my husband for one day?" The words hung in the sudden silence. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Boone's muscled frame went still as stone, and Mary Beth felt her last hope crumbling. What had she done? This proud, solitary man would surely push her away, add his rejection to her shame. But then his calloused hand covered hers where it gripped his arm. "Stand up," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the hushed street. Mary Beth's legs shook as she tried to rise, the mud making her slip again. Without hesitation, Boone bent and swept off his leather vest, wrapping it around her shoulders. The warm leather engulfed her, smelling of smoke and honest work. "Ain't right," came a new voice, her stepfather, pushing through the crowd. "That's my property you're meddling with, Boone." Tiago's jaw tightened as he turned to face Collins. "A daughter ain't property." His voice was soft, dangerous. "And she ain't yours no more." He turned back to Mary Beth, his expression gentling. "Miss Collins asked me a question," he announced, loud enough for all to hear. "And I'm saying yes." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mary Beth's heart thundered in her chest. Was this really happening? She'd only meant to escape the immediate humiliation, but Boone's words carried the weight of something more permanent. "You can't do that," Collins sputtered. "She's under my roof, my authority." "Not anymore." Boone's arm curved protectively around Mary Beth's shoulders. "We'll see the preacher today. Right now." Mrs. Whitaker's scandalized gasp cut through the murmuring. "Reverend Kane won't perform a marriage like this. It ain't proper." Then we'll ride to Silver Creek, Boone replied steadily. Judge Wilson owes me a favor. He'll marry us legal and proper. Mary Beth felt the strength of him beside her, solid as the mountains themselves. She should have been terrified at how quickly events were moving, but instead, a strange calm settled over her. This man she barely knew was offering her more kindness in these few minutes than she'd known in years. You can't just take her. Collins advanced, his face mottled with rage. I'll have the law on you. The law? Boone's quiet laugh held no humor. You pushed your stepdaughter naked into the street. Reckon the sheriff might have something to say about that. He looked down at Mary Beth. If you're certain about this, we should go now. Mary Beth met his gaze. Behind the strength, she saw question in his eyes. He was giving her a choice. She could say no. Step away from this precipice. But what waited behind her? More shame, more cruelty, more lonely nights crying into her pillow? I'm certain, she whispered. Boone nodded once, then swept her up into his arms as easily as lifting a child. She gasped, clutching the vest closer around her as he strode toward the blacksmith's shop. Joe, he called out to the blacksmith. My horse, ready? Just finished the shoe, Joe answered, leading out Boone's big bay gelding. His eyes widened at the sight of Mary Beth in Boone's arms, but he said nothing. Much obliged. Boone settled Mary Beth carefully on the horse, then swung up behind her. The crowd parted before them like water around a rock as he turned the horse toward the road leading out of town. You'll regret this, Collins shouted after them. Ain't no man wants a wife shaped like that. Mary Beth flinched at the words, but Boone's arm tightened around her waist. Don't listen, he murmured close to her ear. Man like that, his words ain't worth the breath they ride on. They rode in silence for a few minutes, the town falling away behind them. The leather vest and Boone's warmth at her back kept the worst of the cold at bay, but Mary Beth couldn't stop trembling. What had she done? What would happen now? We'll stop at the Wilson place, Boone said finally. His wife Emma's about your size. She can loan you proper clothes before we see the judge. He paused. Unless you've changed your mind? Mary Beth shook her head. No, sir. I'm grateful. More than I can say. She swallowed hard. But you don't have to really marry me. Just getting me away from there is kindness enough. The horse's hooves beat a steady rhythm on the packed earth, as Boone considered this. Way I see it, he said slowly. You need protecting. I need. Well, cabin's too quiet sometimes. Might be we could help each other. But I'm not. Mary Beth's voice caught. You heard what they said. About how I look. I'm not the kind of wife a man would want. Heard a lot of fool talk back there, Boone replied. Didn't hear much truth. His voice roughened. I've watched you sometimes, coming out of church. Seen how gentle you are with them. Orphan kids, even when their mothers pull them away. Seen you leaving food by Widow Jensen's door when you barely had enough yourself. He cleared his throat. Reckon that's the kind of wife any man with sense would want. Fresh tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks. But these weren't from shame. No one had ever spoken of her with such simple respect before. She felt Boone shift behind her, uncomfortable with his own speech. Don't mean to press you, he added. But offer stands. Real marriage, if you want it. Could be we'd both find something worth having. The morning sun broke through the clouds then, touching the autumn-painted hills with gold. Mary Beth breathed in the clean mountain air, feeling something unfurl in her chest, something that felt like hope. I want it, she said softly. A real marriage. Boone's only response was a gentle squeeze of his arm around her waist, but somehow that was answer enough. They rode on toward Silver Creek, toward whatever future God had in mind for this most unexpected of unions. The muddy street fell silent as Thiago Boone stood over Mary Beth's trembling form. Without hesitation, he shrugged off his heavy wool coat, the leather patches at the elbows worn smooth from years of hard work. The coat still held the warmth of his body as he draped it gently around Mary Beth's shoulders, covering her completely. Easy now, he murmured, his voice meant only for her ears. His calloused hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. The coat engulfed her, reaching almost to her ankles, and she clutched it close like armor. Thiago turned to face the gathered crowd, his broad shoulders squared. This here's my wife, he declared, his deep voice carrying clearly down the muddy street. The words rang with authority, daring anyone to challenge them. Gasps rippled through the onlookers. Several women covered their mouths with gloved hands, while the men shifted uncomfortably. Near the front of the crowd, Sheriff Grady froze mid-stride, his hand dropping away from his gun belt. Reverend Kane, who had been watching with stern disapproval, bowed his head. His wife's earlier whispers about indecency laws died on her lips as she tugged nervously at her high collar. The jeering that had filled the street moments ago dissolved into uneasy silence, where there had been cruel laughter. Now there were only the sounds of boots shuffling in the mud and the distant cry of a hawk wheeling overhead. Thiago's arm settled protectively around Marybeth's shoulders. "We're going inside now," he announced, his tone brooking no argument. He guided her toward Whitaker's general store, his steps measured to match her unsteady pace. The crowd parted before them, like leaves before a wind. Thiago pushed open the heavy wooden door, the bell above tinkling sharply in the tense quiet. He ushered Marybeth inside, where the familiar scents of coffee beans, leather, and tobacco hung in the air. Old man Whitaker stood frozen behind his counter, a tin of hard candy suspended in his hands. His rheumy eyes darted between Thiago and Marybeth, then to the window where curious faces pressed against the glass. "We need a moment," Thiago said firmly. Whitaker nodded quickly and retreated to his back room, the tin rattling in his trembling hands. As soon as they were alone, Marybeth's composure crumbled. She began to shake violently, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her voice catching. "I'm so sorry to involve you in this. I didn't know what else to do. They were all laughing, and I couldn't bear it anymore." "Hush now," Thiago said softly, keeping his distance to preserve her dignity but staying close enough to shield her from the window's prying eyes. "You asked me to pretend. I'll see it through." A sob escaped her. "But why? You don't know me. Don't owe me anything." Thiago's weathered face hardened as he glanced toward the window. Saw enough out there to know what kind of men would do that to a woman. Saw enough to know what kind would stand by and let it happen. He looked back at her, his expression gentling. Sometimes a man has to choose what side he's standing on. The bell above the door jangled, and Sheriff Grady stepped inside, removing his hat. His boots left muddy prints on the plank floor as he approached, trying to project authority despite his obvious discomfort. "Now, Boone," he began, clearing his throat, "if you're claiming this woman as your wife, you ought to understand what that means legally." He shifted his weight, hat spinning nervously in his hands. "You'll be responsible for all her debts and upkeep. Her stepfather says she owes him for room and board these past 3 years since her mama passed." Thiago's jaw tightened. "That's so. And there's the matter of proper documentation," the sheriff continued. "Marriage license, proof of, I know the law, Grady." Thiago cut in quietly. "Know it better than some who wear a badge." His meaning was clear, and the sheriff's face reddened. Marybeth touched Thiago's arm lightly. "Please, you don't have to do this. The debts, they'll ruin you." "I never meant..." "How much?" Thiago asked the sheriff, ignoring her protest. Sheriff Grady named a sum that made Marybeth gasp. It was more money than she'd ever seen, more than she could hope to earn in years of honest work. Her stepfather had inflated the debt grotesquely, she knew, but who would believe her word against his? To her amazement, Thiago didn't flinch at the amount. "Tell Collins I'll have his money by week's end, but he signs over any claim to her, puts it in writing with witnesses." "Thiago, no," Marybeth pleaded. "It's too much. You can't." "Can and will," he said firmly. "Sheriff, you'll witness the paperwork?" Grady nodded slowly. "I'll draw it up proper." "But Boone," he hesitated. "You sure about this? Taking on a wife, that's no small thing. And, with all this irregular business." "Said she's my wife," Thiago replied simply. "Man's word ought to mean something, don't you reckon?" The sheriff studied him for a long moment, then nodded again. "Reckon it ought to." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'll have them papers ready by sundown. You can bring the money then." He turned to leave, then paused. "And Boone, get the lady some proper clothes before you bring her out again. Town's got standards." After the sheriff left, silence filled the store. Marybeth stood wrapped in Thiago's coat, her mind spinning with all that had happened in the space of an hour. This morning she had been trapped in her stepfather's house, enduring his cruel taunts. Now she stood here, claimed as wife by a man she barely knew. who had just agreed to pay an impossible sum for her freedom. "Why?" she whispered again. "All that money. I'm not worth it." Tiago turned to her, his eyes intent. Man sets a price on another person's worth. He's already lost his own. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a leather pouch that hung from a cord around his neck. "Got something to show you." From the pouch, he withdrew a carefully folded piece of paper, brown with age at the creases. He handled it gently as he opened it, revealing a newspaper clipping. "Can you read?" he asked. Mary Beth nodded. "Mama taught me before she passed." He held out the clipping. The paper was so worn the words were barely legible, but she could make them out. Charity Collins, beloved wife of James Collins, and mother to Mary Beth, passed into God's grace this day. Her mother's obituary. She looked up at Tiago, confused. "Your mama," he said softly. "She helped me once, years back, when I was sick with mountain fever. Found me in my cabin, nursed me through it. Wouldn't take a penny in payment. Just made me promise if I ever saw someone in need of help, I'd do the same." He carefully refolded the paper. Been carrying this, waiting to keep that promise. Fresh tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks, but these were different from the tears of shame and fear she'd shed earlier. "She never told me," she whispered. "Way she talked about you," Tiago said, tucking the pouch back into his shirt. "You were her whole world. Said you had her same kind heart." He met her eyes. "Reckon she was right about that." Before Mary Beth could respond, the store's back door creaked open and old man Whitaker poked his head out. "Got some ladies' things in the back room," he offered hesitantly. "My Emma left behind when we closed the dress shop. Nothing fancy, but they're clean. Better than—" He gestured vaguely at the coat. "Much obliged," Tiago said. He turned to Mary Beth. "I'll wait out front. Take what you need, Mrs. Boone." The name sent a shiver through her. It wasn't real, she reminded herself. Just pretend. Just protection. But something in the way he said it, so matter of fact, made it feel solid somehow, like a foundation she could build on. "Thank you," she managed to say. It wasn't enough. Could never be enough. But his slight nod told her he understood. He moved toward the door, then stopped. "One more thing." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a simple gold band. "Was my mother's," he explained, holding it out. "Might help make things look more proper." Mary Beth stared at the ring, her heart pounding. This was too much, too generous. But when she met his eyes, she saw no pity there, no calculation. Just quiet certainty. With trembling fingers, she took the ring. It slipped onto her left hand, as if it had been made for her. When she looked up again, Tiago was already stepping outside to face whatever waited in the street. She watched through the window as he stood on the boardwalk, his presence alone keeping the lingering onlookers at bay. Her protector, her pretend husband, the man who had just entangled himself in her troubles without a moment's hesitation. Old man Whitaker cleared his throat. "Them clothes is back here, Mrs. Boone. Whenever you're ready." Mrs. Boone. She looked down at the ring glinting on her finger, then back at Tiago's straight figure standing guard outside. Pretend or not, she had a name now that wasn't tied to shame. She had a chance at something new. Taking a deep breath, Mary Beth followed Whitaker toward the back room, ready to take the first step into whatever future lay ahead. Sheriff Grady pulled a worn leather notebook from his vest pocket, licking his thumb to flip through the pages. The general store's dim light caught the badge on his chest as he cleared his throat. "Let's see here. According to Mr. Collins, there's the matter of room and board." He squinted at his chicken scratch writing. 3 years' worth, at $5 per week. Mary Beth's hands trembled beneath Tiago's coat. "But I cooked all the meals, cleaned the house, tended his garden. $780. The sheriff continued, as if she hadn't spoken. "Plus interest." Tiago's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, his eyes fixed on Grady's face. "Then there's his tavern tabs." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Says you agreed to cover those too." "I never," Mary Beth began. But her voice failed as fresh tears threatened. $245 at the Golden Nugget. Grady flipped another page. "And Dr. Morrison submitted his bill for treating your various ailments. $312. What ailments?" Tiago's quiet question carried dangerous undertones. Mary Beth shook her head. "I was never sick," Never saw the doctor once since Mama died. The sheriff tugged at his collar. Well now, that's between you and the doctor. I just record the legal claims. He totaled the figures. Comes to $1,337, all told. The sum hung in the air like gunsmoke. It was more money than most honest men saw in years of hard work. Tiago's expression didn't change, but his fingers curled into fists at his sides. A swindle, he said softly. And you know it, Grady. The sheriff's face reddened. Now see here, Boone. You'll have your money. Tiago cut him off. By week's end, like I said, but first. He turned to Old Man Whitaker, who had been hovering nervously nearby. The lady needs proper clothes. Whitaker nodded eagerly, perhaps relieved to move past the tense moment. Yes, yes. This way, Mrs. Boone. He gestured toward the back room. Emma's things should fit fine. Good, sturdy cloth. Barely worn. Mary Beth hesitated, looking up at Tiago. He gave her a slight nod. Go on, get what you need. While she followed Whitaker, Tiago reached for the leather pouch at his neck. The sheriff watched as he counted out coins onto the counter. That'll cover the dress and shoes, Tiago said, plus some basic provisions. Mighty generous, Grady observed, for a woman you just met. Tiago's eyes met his. Man does right by his wife. Wife, the sheriff repeated skeptically. You expect folks to believe. Don't much care what folks believe. Tiago's tone ended further discussion. When Mary Beth emerged from the back room, she wore a simple brown dress that hung a bit loose but covered her properly. Her feet were clad in serviceable leather shoes, and she'd managed to pin up her hair with some borrowed combs. She still clutched Tiago's coat like armor. Keep it, he said when she tried to return it. Mountain gets cold. They gathered basic supplies: flour, coffee, salt, pork, matches. Tiago added a warm shawl to the pile without comment. Through it all, Mary Beth moved like someone in a dream, as if afraid too sudden emotion might shatter whatever spell had brought her this unexpected protection. Outside, the afternoon sun had begun its descent behind the mountains. Townsfolk still lingered on the boardwalks, whispering behind their hands as Tiago and Mary Beth emerged. Words like scandal and strange couple drifted on the cooling air. Tiago ignored them all, leading the way to where his horse stood, patiently at the hitching post. The big bay gelding flicked an ear in greeting. Why? Mary Beth's quiet question made him pause as he checked the saddle girth. Why help me? Risk so much. He straightened, meeting her uncertain gaze. No decent man could have done different, he said simply. Not, and live with himself after. But the money, it's too much. I can't ever repay. Ain't asking you to. He adjusted the stirrup, then turned to face her fully. What they did, throwing you out like that, trying to shame you, wasn't right. Man sees wrong being done. He's got two choices. Stand by and let it happen, or do something about it. A tear slipped down her cheek. Most chose to stand by. Most ain't me. He offered his hand. Sun's getting low. Best we head out before dark. Mary Beth stared at his calloused palm, then placed her trembling hand in his. With gentle strength, he helped her mount behind him, showing her where to hold onto the saddle. I've never ridden before, she admitted, voice shaking as the horse shifted beneath them. Just hold steady, he assured her. Old Jake here's got sure feet. They set off at an easy walk, Tiago mindful of his nervous passenger. As they passed the church, Mary Beth's fingers tightened on the saddle. The preacher stood on the steps, watching them with an unreadable expression. Ain't got no right to judge, Tiago said quietly. Not him. Not any of them. Mary Beth didn't respond, but she gradually relaxed as they left the town behind. The road wound upward into the mountains, following Clear Creek's tumbling waters. Late afternoon sun painted the aspen leaves gold, and a cool breeze carried the scent of pine. After a while, Mary Beth found herself leaning closer to Tiago's broad back, drawing comfort from his steady presence. The rhythm of the horse's gait and the peaceful mountain scenery began to ease the day's terrible tensions. How far? She asked when they paused to let Jake drink from the creek. Another hour, maybe less. Tiago surveyed the trail ahead. Cabins up past the old silver mine, near Timberline. Got good grazing there for the stock, clean spring water. He helped her down so they could both stretch their legs. Marybeth winced as her unused riding muscles protested. Here. He offered her his canteen. Small sips. She drank carefully, watching as he checked Jake's hooves and patted the horse's neck. Everything about him spoke of competence and care for his animal, for the land, and somehow, inexplicably, for her. I don't know your full name, she realized suddenly. Proper wife ought to know that much at least. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. Tiago Boone. Family was Portuguese, way back. Father trapped these mountains before the silver strikes brought the towns. And now you trap too? He shook his head. Some. Mostly I cut timber. Do odd work when folks need something built or mended. He helped her remount. Not much, but it's honest. The sun was touching the western peaks when they finally reached his cabin. It was small but solid, built of squared logs with a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, with a corral and vegetable patch. Everything spoke of careful maintenance by capable hands. Marybeth felt a curious mix of terror and relief as Tiago helped her down. This was real now, this strange arrangement, this desperate gamble for protection. She stood in the gathering dusk, uncertain, as he led Jake toward the barn. I'll see to him, Tiago said. Get yourself settled inside. Stove should still be warm. She climbed the 3 steps to the cabin's door, then paused with her hand on the latch. Behind her, the mountains rose dark against the fading sky. Below, the lights of the town were starting to twinkle like fallen stars. Everything she'd known, everything she'd been, lay down there. Up here was something new, something unknown. Terrifying, yes, but also promising. She touched the ring on her finger, remembering Tiago's quiet strength, his unflinching defense of her dignity. Taking a deep breath, Marybeth opened the door and stepped inside, carrying her borrowed dignity with her into whatever future awaited. The last rays of sunlight faded behind the mountains as Tiago led Marybeth up the narrow path to his cabin. Snow-laden clouds gathered overhead, and the wind carried a sharp bite that made her pull his coat tighter around her shoulders. Their boots crunched on frozen ground, and nearby, a creek gurgled beneath a thin sheet of ice. The cabin rose before them, solid and strong against the darkening sky. Built of hand-hewn logs carefully fitted together, it stood as a testament to Tiago's skill and patience. A stone chimney stretched up one side, and frost-covered windows gleamed dully in the failing light. Watch your step, Tiago warned as they approached the front door. Steps get slick when the weather turns. Marybeth gripped the rough-hewn railing, careful on the 3 wooden steps that led to a small porch. While she waited, Tiago retrieved a key from beneath a loose board and unlocked the heavy door. It swung open with a creak, revealing darkness within. Give me a moment, he said, stepping inside. She heard him moving about, followed by the scratch of a match. Warm light bloomed as he lit a brass lantern hanging from a beam. Come in before you catch your death. Marybeth stepped through the doorway, immediately enveloped by the lingering warmth from that morning's fire. The cabin's interior surprised her. Not the rough bachelor quarters she'd expected, but a well-ordered space that spoke of care and attention to detail. A pot-bellied stove occupied one corner, its black iron surface reflecting the lantern light. A narrow bed with a quilt stood against the far wall, while shelves lined with books and provisions took up another. A solid table with 2 chairs sat in the center, and hooks along the walls held tools and clothing. Everything had its place, neat and purposeful. She searched for words. So warm, solid. Tiago nodded as he hung up his hat. Needs to be, this high up. Winters get fierce. He moved to the stove, opening its door to check the embers. Still some life here. Won't take long to build it back up. While he worked with the fire, Marybeth stood uncertainly near the door, still clutching his coat around her. The events of the day felt distant now, like a terrible dream. Yet her body ached with the reality of it all. Her feet hurt from the new shoes, and her muscles protested from the long ride. Tiago glanced up from the stove, noting her discomfort. He crossed to a trunk near the bed and pulled out a thick wool blanket. Here, he said, offering it to her. Get settled while I heat up some supper. She accepted the blanket gratefully, finally letting his coat slip from her shoulders. He took it and hung it by the door, then began gathering items from the shelves. A pot, some dried vegetables, preserved meat. Not much, He apologized. "But it'll fill your belly." "Please," she said quickly. "Don't apologize. You've done so much already." She wrapped the blanket around herself and sank into one of the chairs, watching as he worked at the stove. His movements were sure and efficient, a man accustomed to caring for himself. Soon, a rich aroma filled the cabin as he stirred a pot of stew. The warmth from the stove began to seep into Mary Beth's bones, and with it came an overwhelming wave of exhaustion. She fought to keep her eyes open, swaying slightly in her chair. "Been a long day," Tiago observed quietly. He ladled stew into a bowl and placed it before her, along with a spoon and a chunk of bread. "Eat, it'll help." Though her cheeks burned with embarrassment at her hunger, Mary Beth couldn't resist the simple meal. The stew was thick with vegetables and bits of meat, heavily seasoned to mask the preserved taste. She ate slowly at first, then with increasing urgency as her body demanded nourishment. Tiago sat in the other chair with his own bowl, his presence somehow both reassuring and unsettling. They ate in silence, broken only by the pop of the fire and the growing wind outside. Through the windows, Mary Beth could see the first snowflakes beginning to fall. When she finished, Tiago took their bowls to a wash basin. "Take the bed," he said, not looking at her. "I'll sleep in the chair." "Oh no, I couldn't." "You can and will." His tone was firm but gentle. "Been sleeping rough since I was a boy. One night in a chair won't harm me." Mary Beth twisted her hands in the blanket. "This is all so strange," she whispered. "I never thought. I mean, when you said you'd pretend. Best not to dwell on it tonight." He moved the lantern to a hook near the bed. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's soon enough to figure things out." She nodded, too tired to argue further. The bed looked wonderfully inviting, though she felt awkward about sleeping there while he took the chair. Still wrapped in the blanket, she sat on the edge of the mattress, removing only her shoes. Tiago banked the fire in the stove, then settled into the chair. He crossed his arms over his chest and tipped his head back, closing his eyes. The lantern cast his profile in sharp relief. Strong jaw, straight nose, the shadow of beard already darkening his cheeks. "Thank you," Mary Beth said softly, "for everything today. For pretending." One eye opened slightly. "Get some sleep, Mrs. Boone." The name startled her, though she supposed she'd have to get used to it. Lying down, she pulled the quilt over herself, keeping the blanket as well. The bed smelled of pine and wood smoke, clean and somehow comforting. Outside, the snow fell more heavily now, blanketing the clearing in white. The wind whistled through the trees, but inside, the cabin remained snug and warm. Mary Beth watched the dance of shadows on the ceiling, thinking of her mother. Almost without conscious thought, her lips began, moving in the prayer her mother had taught her long ago. "Lord, keep us safe through the darkness of night. Guide us with your eternal light. Grant us peace till morning's ray, and guard us through another day." The familiar words brought tears to her eyes, but also a flutter of hope in her chest. For the first time in years, she felt truly safe, protected, whatever tomorrow might bring. Tonight she had shelter, warmth, and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who'd chosen to help rather than harm. As sleep began to claim her, Mary Beth heard Tiago's steady breathing from the chair. She wondered if he was truly asleep, or simply being polite by pretending. The thought brought a tiny smile to her lips. More pretending, but this time born of respect rather than necessity. The snow continued to fall outside, promising a long winter ahead. But here, in this sturdy cabin, with its sleeping guardian, Mary Beth finally allowed herself to rest. Her last conscious thought was a wordless prayer of gratitude as she drifted into the first peaceful sleep she'd known in years. The first pale light of dawn crept through the cabin's frost-covered windows. Mary Beth stirred beneath the warm quilts, momentarily confused by her surroundings. Then memory rushed back. Yesterday's humiliation, Tiago's rescue, the long ride to this mountain refuge. The chair where he'd slept stood empty now. But she heard a steady rhythm from outside, the distinctive thunk of an axe splitting wood. She rose quietly, smoothing her borrowed dress as best she could. The cabin's interior was chilly, the stove's fire having died down overnight. Through the window she could see Tiago working at a chopping block, his breath forming clouds in the crisp morning air. Each swing of the axe was precise and powerful, adding to the growing pile of split logs beside him. Determined not to remain idle, Mary Beth examined the shelves near the stove. She found coffee beans and a grinder, along with a battered tin pot. Her hands remembered the motions from years of making coffee for her stepfather, though she pushed that memory aside. This morning, she would brew coffee as a gesture of gratitude, not servitude. The familiar task helped settle her nerves. She fed small pieces of kindling into the stove, coaxing the embers back to life. Soon, the coffee pot bubbled cheerfully, filling the cabin with its rich aroma. When Thiago stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots, she had just finished pouring 2 cups. "Smells good," he said, hanging his coat by the door. A light sheen of sweat gleamed on his forehead despite the cold, and his shirt clung to his broad shoulders. "It's the least I could do," Mary Beth replied, offering him a cup. "Please, you must let me help with the chores." "I won't be a burden." Thiago accepted the coffee, studying her over its rim. "No need to prove anything." "But I want to," she insisted. "I'm stronger than I look." The words came out more forcefully than she'd intended, and she felt her cheeks warm. He nodded slowly. "Water needs fetching from the creek. Buckets by the door." Mary Beth grabbed the wooden bucket, eager to show her willingness to work. Outside, the morning sun sparkled on fresh snow, nearly blinding in its brightness. She followed Tiago's boot prints to the creek, where he'd already broken through the thin ice forming at the edges. The current ran swift and clear beneath the frozen surface. Mary Beth knelt carefully, mindful of her skirt on the snowy bank. The bucket was heavier than expected when full, and as she straightened, her foot slipped slightly. Water sloshed over the rim, soaking the hem of her dress. She let out a startled laugh, more from nervousness than humor. "I'll get better at this," she promised, catching Thiago watching from where he'd resumed his wood chopping. "Creek's been here longer than either of us," he replied. "It can wait while you find your footing." Throughout the morning, Mary Beth kept herself busy. She swept the cabin's plank floor, organized the shelves, and helped stack the split wood near the door. Each task gave her a small sense of accomplishment, pushing back against the shame that still lingered from yesterday's events. As afternoon settled in, Mary Beth found herself drawn to a small shelf of books near the bed. Most were practical guides, hunting manuals, plant identification, basic medicine, but tucked between them was a worn Bible, its leather cover soft with age. "Do you read much?" she asked, touching the spine gently. Thiago paused in his work of repairing a leather harness. "Some, when the light's good." "My mother taught me to read using scripture," Mary Beth said softly, before she passed. Would you mind if I read some aloud?" He gestured toward the book with a calloused hand. "Your words might rest easier than my thoughts." Mary Beth carefully opened the Bible, its pages crackling slightly. She turned to the Psalms, finding comfort in their familiar rhythm. Clearing her throat, she began to read. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters." Her voice grew stronger as she continued, the ancient words filling the cabin with their quiet power. Tiago's hands stilled on his work, his eyes focused on the fire in the stove. When she finished reading, a peaceful silence settled between them. "Been a while since I heard those words," he said finally. "Forgot how they could quiet a troubled mind." "Mother always said scripture was like bread for the soul," Mary Beth replied. "Even when we had little else, we had these words." As evening approached, Mary Beth found cornmeal and lard in Tiago's stores. Working quickly, she mixed and shaped cornbread, setting it to bake in a cast-iron skillet. The simple task felt right, transforming basic ingredients into something warm and nourishing. They ate together at the rough table, the cornbread steaming between them. It wasn't much of a meal, but sharing it created a different kind of fellowship than breakfast had. Something about the day's shared work, the reading of psalms, and now this simple bread had begun weaving threads of understanding between them. "Tomorrow I'll show you how to bank the stove fire properly," Thiago said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Keeps the heat longer through the night." Mary Beth nodded, recognizing the offer for what it was, not just practical instruction, but acceptance of her presence, her desire to contribute. "I'd like that," she replied softly. "Thank you." Outside, the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the snow-covered clearing in shades of gold and purple. Inside, the cabin glowed with firelight and the warmth of newly formed companionship. Built not on their pretense of marriage, but on shared work, respect, and the quiet strength they were discovering in each other. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the snow when hoofbeats approached the cabin. Tiago rose from his chair by the fire, hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. But his tension eased as he recognized the familiar pattern of the horse's gait. "Henry," he said, moving to the door. "Been wondering when you'd show up." Mary Beth looked up from where she was mending one of Tiago's shirts, her needle pausing mid-stitch. Through the window, she saw a lean figure dismounting from a paint horse. The man moved with the fluid grace of someone who lived more in the saddle than on foot. Henry Tall Elk led his horse to the shelter of Tiago's lean-to, his dark eyes taking in every detail of the cabin's surroundings. A fresh deer carcass was tied across his saddle, its coat still glossy in the winter light. He wore buckskins and a wool coat, with a rifle slung across his back. Tiago stepped out to greet his friend, their handshake firm and familiar. "Brought meat," Henry said, gesturing to the deer. "Good hunting near Eagle Creek." His voice was deep and measured, carrying the slight accent of someone who grew up speaking Ute before English. "Much obliged," Tiago replied. "Come inside while I dress it. Coffee's hot." Henry's eyes narrowed slightly as he followed Tiago through the cabin door. He spotted Mary Beth immediately, his expression shifting from surprise to careful neutrality. She felt his scrutiny like a physical weight, shrinking slightly in her chair. "Henry," Tiago said, "this here's Mary Beth Collins." He paused, then added with quiet firmness, "My wife." Henry's eyebrows rose fractionally. He looked between them, taking in Mary Beth's borrowed dress and Tiago's protective stance near her chair. After a long moment, he inclined his head in greeting. "Didn't know you'd taken a wife, brother." "Recent," Tiago said simply. He grabbed his skinning knife from its peg. "Help me with that deer." The men worked outside while Mary Beth busied herself preparing supper. Through the window, she watched them dress the deer with practiced efficiency, their movements synchronized from years of shared hunts. Their conversation was sparse but comfortable, punctuated by occasional grunts of effort as they worked. When they finished, Tiago brought in choice cuts of venison. Mary Beth had a pot of beans simmering on the stove, and she quickly prepared the meat, seasoning it with the few spices she'd found in Tiago's stores. The familiar routine of cooking helped calm her nerves under Henry's watchful gaze. They gathered around the table as darkness settled outside. Henry ate methodically, his eyes moving between his hosts. The silence stretched until Mary Beth felt she might crack under its weight. Finally, Henry set down his fork. "Railroad men were in town yesterday," he said, asking questions about landowners along the creek. Tiago's jaw tightened. "What kind of questions? Who owns what? Who owes money?" Henry's dark eyes settled on Mary Beth, who might be pressured to sell. Mary Beth's hands began to tremble. She clasped them tightly in her lap, remembering the list of debts the sheriff had read out. The doctor's mysterious charges, her stepfather's carefully documented tavern tabs. "They're buying up debts," Henry continued. "From merchants, doctors, saloon keepers. Some papers look too clean, too new." He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "My cousin works at the land office. Says he's seen claim papers with ink barely dry, signatures that don't match the originals. Forging documents," Tiago growled. "To take the land." Henry nodded. "Railroad wants a straight line through the valley. Your creek crossing makes a good route." He gestured with his coffee cup. "Good water. Gentle grade. They'll want it." Mary Beth felt sick. "The debts they said I owed," she whispered. "They weren't all real, were they? They were inflated. Made up." "Likely so," Henry agreed. "Railroads got deep pockets. Pays well for cooperation from local folk who help clear their path." Tiago's fist hit the table, making the dishes rattle. "Those bastards set this up. Used you as bait to trap me into taking on debt they could use against the land." "My stepfather," Mary Beth said, realization dawning. "He must have been working with them. That's why she couldn't finish." The memory of her public humiliation still too raw. Henry watched her with new understanding. "Man who'd shame his own kin would sell his soul cheap," he said quietly. "Railroad finds such men useful." "What can we do?" Mary Beth asked. "The army at Fort Garland, surely they wouldn't allow theft through forgery?" "Army watches close," Henry acknowledged. but they prefer peace to justice. Railroad brings soldiers supplies, carries their mail, makes them reluctant to interfere. He turned to Tiago. You'll need proof to fight this. Real papers against their false ones. And witnesses willing to speak truth. Tiago nodded slowly. Your cousin at the land office, could he help? Maybe. For now, he watches. Notes. Which papers smell of fresh ink? Henry rose from the table. I should go. Night riding's safer these days. Less eyes watching. They walked him to his horse. Before mounting, Henry gripped Tiago's arm. Be careful, brother. Railroad men play rough when crossed. And they've got the law's ear. Let them come, Tiago said grimly. This land's mine, earned with sweat and blood. No one takes it with false papers. They watched Henry ride away, his figure melting into the darkness beyond the clearing. The night had grown bitter cold, stars sharp as ice overhead. Marybeth shivered, but not from the chill. I'm so sorry, she whispered. My debts, they're threatening your home because of me. Tiago turned to her, his expression softening. You're not to blame. You're as much their victim as anyone. He gestured at the cabin, the creek beyond. 15 years I've worked this land, built every log of that cabin, dug the root cellar with my own hands. His voice hardened with determination. No one steals this from us without a fight. Us, Marybeth thought. He'd said us, not me. Despite her fear, despite the weight of guilt pressing down, that single word kindled a warm spark in her chest. Whatever came next, she wouldn't face it alone. They returned to the cabin's warmth, each lost in thought about the battle ahead. The venison Henry brought lay wrapped on the shelf, a gift of friendship that now seemed like a symbol of allegiance in the coming storm. Marybeth added wood to the stove, watching the flames leap higher. Outside, a coyote called into the night, its lonely voice echoing off the snow-covered slopes. No answer came back across the silence. Sunday morning dawned clear and cold, frost glazing the cabin's small window panes. Marybeth stood before the cracked mirror Tiago had hung for her, fingers trembling as she smoothed her borrowed dress. The fabric, though clean and mended, still showed signs of wear. We don't have to go, Tiago said from behind her, adjusting his string tie. He'd traded his usual buckskins for clean trousers and his best shirt, though his boots still bore the marks of daily work. Yes, we do, Marybeth whispered, meeting his eyes in the mirror. If I hide away, they win. Tiago nodded, respect flickering across his weathered features. He'd hitched the wagon before sunrise, laying fresh straw in the bed to keep their feet warm during the long ride to town. The morning air bit sharp as they settled onto the wooden seat, Marybeth clutching a worn Bible in her gloved hands. The wagon wheels creaked over frozen ruts as their two draft horses plodded steadily downhill. Tiago had wrapped a heavy blanket around their shoulders, but Marybeth's shivers came more from nerves than cold. Each mile brought them closer to the town where, just days ago, she'd endured the worst humiliation of her life. Hold your head high, Tiago said quietly as the first buildings came into view. You've nothing to be ashamed of. Marybeth's throat tightened. They saw me. She couldn't finish. They saw cruelty, Tiago corrected. Today they'll see strength. The town looked different in the clear morning light. Smoke rose straight from chimneys into the crystal sky. Bells rang from the small white church, calling the faithful to worship. Families walked the boardwalks in their Sunday best. Children scrubbed clean and fidgeting in starched collars. Tiago pulled the wagon to a stop before the church steps. Hearts pounding, Marybeth allowed him to help her down, his strong hands steady at her waist. She kept her eyes forward as they climbed the wooden steps, though she felt the weight of stairs upon them. The church's interior glowed with pale winter sunlight streaming through plain glass windows. Oil lamps flanked the pulpit, their flames barely visible in the morning brightness. Wooden pews, worn smooth by years of worship, stretched in two neat rows toward the altar. Conversation died as they entered. Marybeth heard the rustle of skirts, the sudden hush of whispers. She clutched Tiago's arm, drawing strength from his solid presence. He led them to an empty pew near the back, but the preacher's voice rang out before they could sit. Brother Boone, Reverend Matthews called, his lined face creasing in a gentle smile. Please, you and your wife join us nearer the front. We've space here in the third row. Marybeth's legs nearly failed her as they made their way forward. She felt every eye in the congregation following their progress. The wooden pew creaked as they settled into place, the Bible trembling slightly in her lap. The service began with a familiar hymn. Mary Beth's voice remained trapped in her throat at first, but as the simple melody filled the small sanctuary, she found herself softly joining in. Her mother had taught her these songs long ago, before illness took her, leaving Mary Beth alone with a stepfather's cruelty. After the opening prayers, Reverend Matthews stepped down from his pulpit. "Today," he said, "I'd like to invite Sister Boone to share God's word with us." He approached their pew, extending his worn Bible. "Would you honor us by reading from Psalm 23? Mary Beth froze. She felt Tiago's reassuring touch on her arm, saw the kindness in the preacher's eyes. Slowly, she rose to her feet. The familiar psalm swam before her eyes as she took the Bible with trembling hands. "The Lord is my shepherd," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. She swallowed hard, then continued, drawing strength from the beloved words. "I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures." As she read, her voice grew steadier. These verses had comforted her through countless dark nights. Now they flowed from her heart, filling the hushed sanctuary with ancient promise. "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." When she finished, the silence held a different quality. She looked up to find Mrs. Matthews, the preacher's wife, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief. Other women in the congregation wore similar expressions of moved understanding. The rest of the service passed in a blur of hymns and prayer. Afterward, as the congregation began to disperse, Mrs. Matthews approached them. Her gray hair was pulled back in a neat bun, her dress simple but well made. "Mrs. Boone," she said softly, touching Mary Beth's arm, "would you wait a moment? I have something that might be of use to you." She disappeared into the adjacent parsonage, returning with a carefully wrapped bundle. "Some fabric I've been saving," she explained, pressing it into Mary Beth's hands. "Good, sturdy cotton, suitable for a ranch wife. And there's enough here for at least 2 dresses." Mary Beth's vision blurred with tears as she felt the quality of the cloth through the wrapping. "I can't accept, please," Mrs. Matthews insisted. "Consider it a wedding gift, albeit a late one." Her kind eyes held no trace of the judgment Mary Beth had feared. "Perhaps you'll join Our Lady's sewing circle? We meet Wednesday afternoons." Before Mary Beth could respond, other women began approaching. Mrs. Anderson from the Mercantile offered a sympathetic smile. "We always bring extra baking to share at the circle," she said. "You'd be most welcome. And we could use another voice in the choir," added Mrs. Peterson, who played the church's small pump organ. "You have a lovely, clear tone." Tiago stood quietly beside her, his presence protective but allowing her to navigate these tentative offerings of acceptance on her own. Mary Beth clutched the fabric bundle to her chest, managing to whisper her thanks. They made their farewells and walked back to the wagon. The same townspeople who had jeered days ago now nodded politely or touched their hats in greeting. Tiago helped her up onto the seat, tucking the blanket around them both before clucking to the horses. The sun had risen high enough to begin melting the frost as they headed home. Mary Beth sat in thoughtful silence, one hand resting on the precious bundle of fabric in her lap. The simple kindness of that gift, offered without judgment, had cracked something open inside her. "You did well today," Tiago said quietly as they followed the winding track up into the hills. "They were so different," Mary Beth murmured, not mocking or cruel at all. "Why? Folks can be like sheep sometimes," Tiago replied, quick to follow the loudest voice, whether it leads to cruelty or kindness. "Today, they saw your courage, your faith." He glanced at her, heard your voice speaking truth. Tears spilled down Mary Beth's cheeks, but they weren't tears of shame this time. "I forgot there could be goodness in people," she whispered. "After Mama died, after everything my stepfather did, I stopped believing in kindness." Tiago's hand covered hers where it rested on the blanket. "Kindness ain't always easy to find," he said, "but it's there, if you've the courage to stand still and let it find you." The wagon rattled over familiar ground as they approached the cabin. Smoke rose from the chimney where they'd banked the morning fire. The sight of that spiral of smoke against the winter sky, marking home and safety, brought fresh tears to Mary Beth's eyes. "I never thought I'd feel hope again," she said softly. "But today, in that church, when they looked at me with understanding instead of scorn. "Hope's like a seed," Tiago said. "Doesn't need much to start growing, just a bit of kindness, a little light." He pulled the wagon to a stop before the cabin. "And you've got more strength in you than you know, Mary Beth Boone." She looked at him sharply. It was the first time he'd called her by that name, his name, without hesitation or awkwardness. Something warm unfurled in her chest, like a flower opening to the Sunday. Together they climbed down from the wagon. The horses nickered softly, eager for their stalls and feed. The bundle of fabric was warm in Mary Beth's arms as she mounted the cabin steps, pausing to look back at the valley below. The town was hidden now behind folds of hillside, but she could still hear the echo of hymns, still feel the gentle press of accepting hands. For the first time in years, the future didn't loom like a dark wall before her. Instead, she saw possibility. New dresses to sew, songs to sing, friendships to nurture, small seeds of hope, taking root in soil she'd thought forever barren. The cabin door creaked welcome as they stepped inside, bringing with them the crisp scent of winter air and the warm promise of change. The snow began falling in earnest 3 days after their church visit, blanketing the mountain slopes in heavy white drifts. By morning, the path to town had disappeared entirely beneath the pristine cover, transforming the landscape into a silent white wilderness. Mary Beth woke early to find Tiago already outside, his broad shoulders dusted with snow as he cleared a path to the barn. Through the frosted window pane, she watched him work, admiring the steady rhythm of his movements. The morning light caught the steam of his breath in the cold air. She stirred the banked coals in the stove and added fresh wood, preparing to make breakfast. Her hands moved with growing confidence through the familiar routine, measuring coffee, mixing biscuit dough, setting the kettle to boil. The cabin's warmth wrapped around her like a comfortable blanket. When Tiago stomped his boots clean and came inside, she had hot coffee waiting. "Much obliged," he said, accepting the tin cup with snow-chilled fingers. Their hands brushed briefly in the exchange, sending an unexpected warmth through her chest. "The drifts are deep," he reported, settling into his chair by the fire. "We won't be making any trips to town for a spell." Mary Beth nodded, trying to hide her relief. Though the townspeople had shown kindness at church, she felt safer here, in the cabin's quiet sanctuary. "I reckon we have enough supplies laid by," she said, checking their storage shelf with practiced eyes. "Aye, though we'll need to keep the snares full," Tiago replied. "Game gets scarce in deep winter." They fell into an easy routine as the days passed. Mornings began with Tiago chopping wood, while Mary Beth prepared breakfast. Together they would tend to the livestock, 2 horses, a milk cow, and a small flock of chickens that needed extra care in the bitter cold. Mary Beth found satisfaction in the steady work of cabin life. She kept the fire burning, mended clothes, and prepared simple but filling meals from their stores. The fabric from Mrs. Matthews had become 2 serviceable dresses, worn with quiet pride. One crisp morning, Tiago invited her to help him check the snares he'd set in the nearby woods. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they made their way through the trees, their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Mary Beth marveled at the pristine beauty of the forest, where every branch wore a coat of sparkling white. At the first snare, they found nothing. The second held only disturbed snow, but at the third, they discovered clear signs of a rabbit and an empty snare. "Well, I'll be," Tiago muttered, examining the tracks. Clever little fellow managed to slip free. Something about his bemused expression, the mighty mountain man outsmarted by a rabbit, struck Mary Beth as funny. A giggle escaped before she could catch it. Tiago looked up, surprised, then his own mouth twitched. Suddenly they were both laughing, the sound echoing strange and wonderful through the silent forest. Mary Beth couldn't remember the last time she'd laughed like this, free and unguarded. Tiago's deep chuckle wrapped around her like a warm shawl. "Reckon that rabbit earned his freedom," he said, still smiling as they headed back to the cabin. The shared moment of mirth seemed to lift something between them, making the air lighter somehow. The short winter days fell into a gentle pattern. During daylight hours, they worked side by side at the necessary tasks of survival, hauling water from the creek, preserving meat, patching the cabins chinking against the wind. But it was the evenings Mary Beth came to treasure most. After supper, while the fire burned low, she would read aloud from her mother's Bible. Tiago would sit in his chair, working at various tasks, sharpening his axe, mending harness leather, cleaning his rifle. Though he seldom commented, she could feel him listening, absorbing the familiar words of comfort and promise. Sometimes she would glance up from her reading to find his eyes on her, dark and intent. In those moments, something unspoken seemed to pass between them, making her heart flutter like a captured bird. One evening, as she closed the Bible after reading about Ruth's faithfulness, Tiago set aside the knife he'd been honing. "You've brought something back to this place," he said quietly. "Something I'd forgotten was missing." Mary Beth's hands trembled slightly as she smoothed the Bible's worn cover. "What do you mean?" "Warmth," he replied, his voice low. "Not just from the fire or the cooking, though Lord knows that's welcome enough." He gestured vaguely around the cabin. "There's a different kind of warmth when a home has a woman's touch, when there's someone to share the quiet with." Color rose in Mary Beth's cheeks. She thought of her first night here, huddled in borrowed blankets, uncertain of her place. Now the cabin felt truly like home, with her small touches everywhere. Dried herbs hanging from the rafters, a patchwork cushion on her chair, the subtle improvements to their daily meals. "I'm grateful," she said softly, "for everything you've done, taking me in, protecting me." She swallowed hard, pretending to be my husband. The word hung between them, heavy with implication. Tiago's dark eyes held hers for a long moment before he looked away. "Ain't all pretend," he murmured, so quietly she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. The fire popped, sending up a shower of sparks. Outside, a nightbird called lonely through the darkness. Mary Beth's heart beat fast against her ribs as she tried to find words to respond. But Tiago had already risen, moving to bank the fire for the night. The moment passed, leaving behind a tender ache of uncertainty. Were they still playing roles for the town's benefit? Or had something real grown in these quiet days of shared work and evening scripture? Mary Beth lay awake long that night, listening to Tiago's steady breathing from his chair by the fire. He still insisted on sleeping there, maintaining a careful distance despite their supposed marriage. She thought about the gentle way he treated her, so different from her stepfather's cruelty, about the quiet strength in his hands when he helped her over icy patches, about the warmth in his eyes when she served him dinner or read from the Bible. Whatever was growing between them felt as delicate as the first spring shoots pushing through winter soil. She held the hope of it carefully in her heart, afraid to examine it too closely lest it shatter like frost. Outside, snow continued to fall, wrapping their small cabin in a blanket of silence. Inside, the fire burned low, casting soft shadows on the walls. In that peaceful space between waking and sleeping, Mary Beth offered up a prayer of gratitude for this unexpected sanctuary, and for the man whose pretense of marriage had become something far more precious than she dared to dream. The night deepened, full of unspoken possibilities. Tomorrow would bring more shared tasks, more quiet moments, more careful steps along the path between pretense and truth. For now, the gentle rhythm of their life together was enough. Two souls finding unexpected warmth in a winter-bound cabin, learning day by day what it meant to truly belong. The peace of their mountain sanctuary shattered on a bitter Tuesday evening. Mary Beth had just set fresh cornbread on the table when hoofbeats thundered up the snowy path to their cabin. Tiago reached for his rifle, but before he could grab it, the door burst open. Cold wind and snow swirled in with three men. Deputy Marshal Wilson, flanked by two railroad company men in expensive coats. "Tiago Boone," the deputy announced, his voice flat. "You're under arrest for the abduction of Mary Beth Collins." "What?" Mary Beth gasped, her hand flying to her throat. "No, there must be some mistake." Behind the lawmen, another figure stumbled into view. Mary Beth's blood ran cold as she recognized her stepfather, Harrison Collins. His face was flushed with whiskey, but his eyes gleamed with cruel satisfaction. "There's my wayward girl," Harrison slurred, jabbing a finger in her direction. "Took her right off the street, he did, against her will and mine." "That's a lie," Mary Beth cried. "I asked for his help. He saved me when you—" "We have sworn statements," one of the railroad men interrupted smoothly, pulling papers from his coat. "Multiple witnesses saw Mr. Boone forcibly remove Miss Collins from town. As her legal guardian, Mr. Collins has every right to press charges." Tiago stood very still, his face hard as granite. "Show me these papers." The deputy handed over several documents. Mary Beth watched Tiago's jaw clench as he read. Even from where she stood, she could see multiple signatures at the bottom. Townspeople who had witnessed that day in the street. "These are twisted half-truths," Tiago said quietly. "You've manipulated what happened." "The law sees what it sees," the second railroad man said with a cold smile. "And what it sees is a mountain man kidnapping a vulnerable young woman." Deputy Wilson stepped forward, chains rattling in his hands. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Boone." "No, please." Mary Beth rushed forward, but Harrison grabbed her arm roughly, yanking, and her back. The familiar terror of his grip made her knees weak. "You're coming home where you belong," Harrison growled in her ear. "These fine gentlemen helped me understand my rights as your guardian. The railroad company's been mighty interested in sorting out this whole situation." Tiago's eyes flashed dangerously at Harrison's handling of Mary Beth. He took one step forward, but the deputy and railroad men drew their pistols in perfect unison. "Don't," Mary Beth pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "Don't let them hurt you." For a long moment, Tiago stood motionless, measuring the odds. Then slowly, deliberately, he held out his wrists. The deputy quickly shackled them while the railroad men kept their weapons trained on him. "Your land will cover the legal costs," one of the railroad men mentioned casually. "Once the territory court processes the paperwork, of course." Understanding dawned in Mary Beth's eyes. This wasn't just about her. It was about Tiago's land. The railroad wanted it, and they were using her stepfather's claim on her to get it. They had probably paid Harrison handsomely for his cooperation. "You can't do this," she whispered. "Already done, girl," Harrison sneered. "Time to remember your place." The deputy took Tiago's arm. "We'll walk him to the horses. Mr. Collins, you get your stepdaughter sorted." "No." Mary Beth tried to pull away from Harrison's grip. "Tiago." Tiago turned at the door, his eyes meeting hers. "Keep faith," he said softly. Then the deputy pushed him outside into the swirling snow. Harrison's fingers dug painfully into Mary Beth's arm. "You'll stay right here till I send for you. Can't have you causing more trouble in town." He shoved her roughly away, making her stumble against the table. "The railroad boys reckon it's safer if folks don't see you till the trial's done. You're leaving me here alone?" Mary Beth's voice shook. "Ain't like you ain't been living here already," Harrison sneered. "Besides, can't have you telling tales that might mess up our case." He gestured to the railroad men. "Gentlemen?" The railroad men tipped their hats with mocking politeness and followed Harrison out. The door slammed behind them, leaving Mary Beth alone in the suddenly silent cabin. Through the window, she watched helplessly as they led Tiago away. The chains gleamed dully in the fading light as they forced him onto a horse. Her stepfather and the railroad men mounted up as well, and soon the whole group disappeared into the thickening snow. Mary Beth's legs gave out. She sank to her knees on the rough wooden floor, sobs racking her body. The cornbread she'd baked sat cooling and forgotten on the table. Outside, snow hissed against the window panes like angry whispers. "Please, Lord," she prayed through her tears. "Please don't let them hurt him. Don't let them take his land. He only helped me because it was right and good. Don't let him suffer for showing Christian charity." The cabin offered no answer. The fire popped and crackled in the hearth. But without Tiago's solid presence, the sound seemed hollow and lonely. His empty chair stood like an accusation. All their gentle routines, their growing closeness, shattered by greed and lies. Mary Beth hugged herself, rocking slightly as she tried to think. The marriage had been pretend, yes, but it had felt so real these past weeks. The way Tiago looked at her when she read scripture, his quiet, "thank you," when she served meals, the warmth in his eyes when she made his cabin into a true home. None of that had been pretense. But now, the fiction they'd created would be used against him. Her stepfather and the railroad men would twist their arrangement into something ugly, paint Tiago as a kidnapper and villain, and she was trapped here, unable to speak in his defense. The wind howled outside, rattling the window frames. Mary Beth shivered, suddenly aware of how vulnerable she was. Alone in a cabin miles from town, with snow falling heavily, she had no way to get help, no way to fight the lies being told about Tiago. She forced herself to stand on shaking legs. First things first, she needed to keep the fire going. Tiago had taught her how to bank it properly for the night. The familiar task helped steady her hands, if not her heart. Next, she checked the door. They hadn't bothered to lock it. The weather was prison enough. The snow was falling so thickly now she could barely see the barn where the remaining horse and cow were sheltered. Marybeth moved through the cabin, touching things that reminded her of Tiago, his spare shirt hanging by the fire, the knife he used to carve kindling, the Bible they'd shared each evening. Each item seemed to mock the emptiness he'd left behind. "I won't let them win," she whispered fiercely. "Somehow, I'll find a way to help him." But fear gnawed at her resolve. Her stepfather had always been cruel, but now he had powerful allies. The railroad company wanted Tiago's land, and they clearly didn't care how they got it. They would use her, use the very kindness Tiago had shown her, to destroy him. Night fell fully, turning the windows into black mirrors. Marybeth lit the lamp with trembling fingers, its small flame doing little to dispel the growing shadows. The sound of her own breathing seemed too loud in the silence. She tried to pray again, but the words stuck in her throat. Instead, she opened the Bible to the Psalms, seeking comfort in the familiar verses. Her eyes fell on words that spoke of persecution and justice, of the righteous man wrongly accused. "Be merciful to me, O God. Be merciful to me. For in you my soul takes refuge," she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. "I will take refuge in the shadow of your wings until the disasters have passed." The words brought tears to her eyes again. She remembered how Tiago would listen so intently when she read, his strong hands still but his spirit clearly moved. How could anyone believe he was capable of the evil they accused him of? Snow continued to hiss against the glass, a constant reminder of her isolation. Marybeth pulled Tiago's spare coat around her shoulders, breathing in the lingering scent of wood smoke and honest work. Her heart ached with a pain deeper than any physical blow her stepfather had ever landed. This was worse than the day they'd forced her into the street in nothing but a flour sack. Then, she had only her own shame to bear. Now she carried the weight of knowing her presence in Tiago's life had brought him to ruin. The night stretched endless before her, full of shadows and fears. Somewhere in the darkness, Tiago sat in a cold jail cell, wrapped in chains instead of the quiet dignity she'd come to cherish, while she remained in his cabin, surrounded by evidence of the life they'd begun to build together, a life that now seemed as fragile as morning frost. "Lord," she prayed again, clutching the Bible to her chest. "Show me what to do. Show me how to help him. Please don't let this pretend marriage be the thing that destroys him." But only the wind answered, keening around the cabin's corners like a mourning woman's cry. The morning dawned bitter cold, with fresh snow blanketing the land in pristine white. Marybeth stood at the cabin window, watching the pale winter sun struggle through heavy clouds. She had barely slept, spending most of the night praying and planning. Her hands trembled as she pulled on her warmest clothes. The simple dress she'd sewn from the preacher's wife's fabric, thick woolen stockings, and sturdy boots Tiago had bought her. Over everything, she wrapped herself in a quilt from the bed. The thought of leaving the cabin's safety made her stomach clench. But she couldn't sit idle, while Tiago suffered in jail. The trek to the barn was difficult, snow reaching past her ankles. Inside, the remaining horse nickered softly at her approach. Marybeth's hands shook as she worked. With the unfamiliar saddle and bridle, Tiago had shown her the basics of horsemanship, but she'd never attempted to saddle up alone. "Please," she whispered to the horse, "help me do this right." The horse stood patient as she fumbled with buckles and straps. Finally satisfied everything was secure, she led him out into the snow. Mounting was another challenge. Her weight made it difficult, but desperation gave her strength. After 3 attempts, she settled into the saddle, gathering the reins as Tiago had taught her. The ride into town was slow and treacherous. The horse picked his way carefully through the deep snow while Marybeth hunched against the biting wind. Her thighs ached from gripping the saddle, and her fingers grew numb despite thick mittens. But she pressed on, driven by thoughts of Tiago alone in his cell. Main Street was quiet when she arrived, most folks sensibly staying indoors. Marybeth tied the horse outside the sheriff's office, her heart pounding as she approached the door. The bell jingled as she entered, announcing her presence to Sheriff Grady, who sat at his desk nursing a cup of coffee. "Mrs. Boone," he said, his voice careful and formal. "Didn't expect to see you in town today." "Please," Marybeth said, forcing herself to stand straight despite her trembling. I need to see my husband. The sheriff's face hardened. Now, Miss Collins. Mrs. Boone, she corrected firmly, though her voice quavered. Whatever you're calling yourself, Sheriff Grady said, you'd best head back to that cabin and stay quiet. Your stepfather's mighty upset about this whole situation. But Tiago's innocent. He only helped me because you asked him to pretend to be your husband? The sheriff cut her off. That's called fraud, miss. And if you keep pushing, you might find yourself facing charges too. Mary Beth's hands clenched in her skirts. He showed Christian charity when no one else would. That ain't how the law sees it. Sheriff, Grady stood, towering over her. Go home, Miss Collins. Don't make more trouble than you already have. Tears burned in Mary Beth's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Without another word, she turned and fled the office, the bell's cheerful jingle mocking her defeat. The ride back to the cabin seemed twice as long, the cold biting deeper now that despair had settled in her heart. By the time she finished tending to the horse and stumbled back inside, her fingers were blue with cold and her face wet with frozen tears. She huddled by the stove, trying to warm herself, but the chill seemed bone-deep. The cabin felt emptier than ever, haunted by memories of shared meals and quiet evenings. Her gaze fell on her small bundle of belongings, still tucked in the corner where she'd left them that first night. Something tugged at her memory. Her mother's Bible, carried close through all the years of her stepfather's cruelty. She hadn't opened it since coming to the cabin, finding more comfort in reading from Tiago's larger copy. But now she felt drawn to this last connection to her mother. With trembling fingers, Mary Beth unwrapped the worn Bible from its protecting cloth. The familiar smell of leather and age brought fresh tears to her eyes. She opened it carefully, thumbing through pages thin with use, some marked with pressed flowers her mother had loved to collect. A folded paper slipped from between the pages, yellowed with age but still crisp. Mary Beth picked it up, curious. She'd never noticed it before. As she unfolded it, her heart began to race. It was a deed, written in flowing script and bearing official stamps. She read it slowly, her eyes widening as understanding dawned. The document granted her mother full ownership of a natural spring and its water rights, a spring that fed the very creek running past Tiago's cabin. Mary Beth's hands shook as she read further. The deed was dated 15 years ago, signed and witnessed properly. Her mother had never mentioned it, perhaps keeping it secret from Harrison after their marriage. But here was proof, legal proof, that the water rights belonged to her mother's estate, not her stepfather. "Oh, Mama," she whispered, touching the signature reverently. "You left me a way to fight back." The implications slowly unfolded in her mind. Without control of the water rights, her stepfather's claims to the land were worthless. The railroad couldn't seize property without guaranteed water access, and that access belonged to her, as her mother's only heir. Hope bloomed in her chest, warm and fierce. This deed could save not just Tiago's land, but his freedom. It proved her stepfather had no right to press charges, no authority to claim she'd been kidnapped from property he didn't legally own. Mary Beth clutched the deed close, her mind racing. She needed help to use this properly. Someone who understood the law and wouldn't be afraid to stand against the railroad men. The preacher might know someone, or perhaps Henry had connections who could help. Outside, the wind had died down, leaving the world hushed and expectant. The afternoon sun broke through the clouds, sending diamonds of light dancing across the snow. Mary Beth stood at the window, watching the creek that had seemed so ordinary yesterday. Now she saw it differently. Not just water flowing past, but a lifeline of hope. A gift from her mother reaching across years to help her stand strong. She carefully refolded the deed and tucked it into her dress pocket, close to her heart. For the first time since Tiago's arrest, she felt steady, anchored by purpose. Tomorrow she would find a way to use this discovery, but for now, she had work to do. The animals needed tending, the fire needed feeding, and she needed to keep Tiago's home ready for his return. "I won't let them win," she promised the quiet cabin. "Mama gave me the means to fight, and fight I will." The sound of chopping wood echoed across the kind, clearing as Mary Beth set to work, her movements now purposeful and sure. She might be alone in the cabin, but she was no longer helpless. Like the hidden spring feeding the creek, strength flowed from an unexpected source, nourishing hope in frozen ground. The morning sun cast long shadows across fresh fallen snow as Mary Beth secured her mother's Bible and the precious deed inside her coat. Her fingers trembled as she fastened the buttons, but determination steadied her heart. Tiago needed her, and for once in her life, she had the power to help someone else. Henry's horse stomped restlessly in the pre-dawn chill, his breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The sturdy Pinto wasn't as gentle as Tiago's mount, but Henry had insisted she take him when she'd explained her discovery. "He knows the winter trails," Henry had said, his dark eyes serious. "He'll keep you safe." Mary Beth approached the horse carefully, speaking soft words of encouragement as she checked the cinch one final time. The saddle felt secure under her tentative touch. Taking a deep breath, she gathered her skirts and mounted with more confidence than she'd shown yesterday, though her weight still made the task awkward. The horse moved forward steadily, picking his way through the deep snow. Wind whipped at Mary Beth's coat, finding every gap despite her careful bundling. Her cheeks burned with cold, and her eyes watered, but she kept her focus on the trail ahead. The ride into town seemed endless. Every creak of leather, every snapping twig made her jump, imagining her stepfather's men lying in wait. But the forest remained peaceful, disturbed only by the occasional flutter of snow falling from laden branches. Main Street was beginning to stir as Mary Beth rode in, shopkeepers sweeping their boardwalks clear of snow, women hurrying to make early morning purchases before the worst of the day's cold set in. A few people paused to stare as she passed, but Mary Beth kept her chin high, remembering Tiago's words about standing tall. Henry waited outside the livery stable, his face grave beneath his wide-brimmed hat. He stepped forward to help her dismount, his movements careful and respectful. "You have the paper?" he asked quietly. Mary Beth nodded, patting her coat where the deed lay protected. "Right here, safe and dry." "Good." Henry took the horse's reins, leading both of them into the relative warmth of the stable. Inside, the familiar smells of hay and leather provided strange comfort. "Show me," he said, closing the door against prying eyes. With trembling fingers, Mary Beth withdrew the deed from her coat. The paper had yellowed with age, but the ink remained clear and dark. Henry studied it carefully, his expression thoughtful. "This is proper," he said finally. "All signed and witnessed. Your mother was wise to keep it hidden." "Can it help, Tiago?" Mary Beth asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry nodded slowly. "This proves your stepfather had no right to the land he claims you were taken from. Without that claim, the kidnapping charge falls apart." He handed the deed back carefully. "But you'll have to present it in court yourself. The judge needs to hear your testimony." Fear clutched at Mary Beth's throat. "Speak in court? In front of everyone? You're stronger than you know," Henry said, his voice gentle but firm. "I've watched you these past weeks. You've found your courage, just like the deer finds its legs." Tears pricked at Mary Beth's eyes, but she blinked them back. "Will you help me? Stand with me?" "I give you my word," Henry replied solemnly. "My people know about broken promises and stolen land. I'll speak truth about Tiago's character and your right to be on that homestead." They spent the next hour preparing her testimony, Henry's quiet guidance helping Mary Beth organize her thoughts. She would need to explain how she came to have the deed, prove her mother's ownership, and show how her stepfather's claims were false. "Remember," Henry advised, "speak plain and true. The judge will see your honest heart." As morning wore on, more people began moving through the stable. Henry tensed at each new arrival, but none seemed to pay them much mind. Still, they both knew they couldn't stay hidden forever. "The preacher's wife offered me shelter," Mary Beth said softly. "Said I could stay at the parsonage until the hearing." Henry nodded approval. "Good. Safer there than the cabin alone. I'll keep watch on Tiago's land. Make sure nobody causes trouble while you're gone." Mary Beth touched his arm briefly, a gesture of gratitude she'd seen his people use. "Thank you, Henry. For everything." A ghost of a smile crossed his weathered face. "Tiago called me brother long before others would shake my hand. I won't abandon his wife now." The word wife made Mary Beth's heart flutter. What had started as desperate pretense had grown into something real, something worth fighting for. She straightened her shoulders, clutching the deed close. Henry led her out of the stable by a back way, ensuring no one followed as they made their way to the small white church. The preacher's wife, Mrs. Mason, met them at the door, her kind face creased with concern. "Come in quickly, dear." she said, ushering Marybeth inside. "I've got the spare room ready and hot tea waiting." Henry touched his hat in farewell. "I'll return tomorrow morning. We'll face the judge together." The parsonage was warm and smelled of fresh bread. Mrs. Mason took Marybeth's coat, clucking sympathetically at how cold she was. "You poor thing, riding through this weather. Come, get warm by the stove." Other women from the congregation appeared throughout the day, bringing food and quiet words of encouragement. Some who had witnessed her shame in the street now pressed her hands warmly, asking forgiveness for their earlier judgment. Each visit strengthened Marybeth's resolve. As evening approached, Mrs. Mason shooed the last visitors away. "You need rest, dear. Tomorrow will be challenging enough." But as Marybeth prepared for bed, she heard soft voices in the parlor. Curious, she crept to the door and peered out. Half a dozen women knelt in a circle, heads bowed in prayer. Their whispered words drifted to her ears. "Lord, give her strength to speak truth. Protect her from those who would harm her. Guide the judge's heart toward justice." Tears spilled down Marybeth's cheeks as she listened. These women, who had once turned away from her shame, now lifted her up in prayer. Their faith wrapped around her like a warm blanket, soothing her fears. She returned to her room and knelt beside the narrow bed. The deed lay on the nightstand beside her mother's Bible, two precious legacies of love and courage. Tomorrow she would use them both to fight for Tiago, for their home, for the life they might build together. "Thank you, Mama," she whispered into the darkness. "Thank you for giving me the means to stand strong." Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside the parsonage, Marybeth felt wrapped in warmth and purpose. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight she rested in the knowledge that she no longer stood alone. The quiet prayers of the women continued late into the night, their voices a gentle murmur of hope and strength. Marybeth drifted to sleep, surrounded by their faith, dreaming of Tiago's smile and the promise of justice to come. Morning sunlight streamed through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the worn wooden floor. The small mountain town's courthouse, though modest in size, seemed to groan under the weight of what felt like every resident who could squeeze inside. Their boots and shoes had tracked in snow and mud, leaving puddles that reflected the harsh winter light. Marybeth stood at the front of the crowded room, her hands clasped tightly together to hide their trembling. The second-hand dress that Tiago had, bought her weeks ago, hung loose now, testament to the hard work of mountain living. She fixed her eyes on the judge's bench, refusing to look at her stepfather's sneering face across the aisle. Judge Harrison, a stern-faced man with iron-gray hair, settled into his chair with deliberate slowness. The creak of wood seemed to echo in the hushed room. He adjusted his spectacles, scanning the gathered crowd with sharp eyes before focusing on the papers before him. "This court will come to order," he announced, his voice cutting through the whispers. "We are here to address charges of kidnapping and fraud against Tiago Boone, as well as associated land claim disputes." The gavel struck once, sharp and final. Marybeth risked a glance toward Tiago, who sat in chains near the front. Despite his bonds, he held himself straight and proud, his eyes meeting hers with quiet strength. The sight gave her courage, remembering all they had shared in those precious weeks at the cabin. Her stepfather, John Collins, rose first when called. His usual whiskey-soaked swagger was hidden beneath a borrowed suit coat that strained across his shoulders, but his eyes held the same mean glint Marybeth remembered from years of abuse. "Your Honor," he began, his voice oily with false concern, "my stepdaughter was taken against her will by this mountain man. We have documents proving my guardianship and rightful claim to the land where she was held." He produced a stack of papers with a flourish. The railroad company's agent, a thin man named Mr. Porter, stepped forward to authenticate the documents. "These are properly filed claims, Your Honor. Mr. Collins has legal authority over both the girl and the disputed property." Marybeth's heart pounded as the papers were passed to the judge. She felt the weight of the true deed in her pocket, her mother's last gift pressing against her like a shield. Judge Harrison examined the documents carefully, his expression unreadable. "And you claim Mr. Boone forcibly removed your stepdaughter from your protection?" "That's right, Your Honor. Carried her off like a savage." John Collins threw a hateful glare at Tiago. "Been keeping her isolated up in the mountains, away from proper Christian folk." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Marybeth saw several townspeople shift uncomfortably, remembering perhaps how they had watched her humiliation in the street that day, how none had stepped forward to help until Tiago. "Miss Collins," the judge turned to her. "Do you wish to speak to these charges?" Mary Beth took a deep breath, feeling Henry's steady presence behind her. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." She stepped forward, her voice stronger than she expected. "My stepfather's claims are false, every word of them." Her fingers touched the deed in her pocket. "I have proof." John Collins started forward, his face darkening. "Now see here." "Silence," Judge Harrison commanded. "The young lady has the floor." With trembling fingers that steadied as she moved, Mary Beth withdrew the deed from her pocket. The yellowed paper crackled as she carefully unfolded it. "This is my mother's deed," she said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the hushed courtroom. "It grants her full ownership of the spring-fed water rights on the disputed land." She held it up, so the sunlight illuminated the careful script. "It is not, and as her only living heir, those rights passed to me upon her death." The railroad agent's face went slack with surprise. John Collins lunged forward, his composure cracking. "She's lying. That paper's worthless." "Order!" The judge's gavel crashed down. "Mr. Collins, contain yourself, or you'll be removed." Mary Beth's hands had stopped shaking entirely now. She looked directly at her stepfather as she began to read. "This deed of ownership, granted to Sarah Marie Collins, wife of the late Thomas Collins." Her voice grew stronger with each word, her mother's name ringing out like a bell of truth. Henry stepped forward when she finished reading. "Your Honor, I can speak to the authenticity of this document." The judge nodded, studying Henry's weathered face. "State your name and connection to this case." "Henry Tall Elk, Your Honor. I've served as scout and guide in this territory for 15 years. I've seen many deeds pass through these parts." He gestured respectfully toward the document Mary Beth held. "This one bears all proper marks and seals. The dates and signatures match records from when that land was first parceled." The railroad agent had begun to sweat visibly. He tugged at his collar, eyes darting between John Collins and the door. Judge Harrison held out his hand. "Let me examine this deed." Mary Beth passed it forward carefully. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath as the judge studied every inch of the document, holding it up to the light, examining the seal. "This appears genuine," he said finally. "Mr. Porter, would you care to explain why your earlier land claim documents show no record of this prior deed?" The railroad agent's face had gone from red to pale. That is, there must have been an oversight in the records." "An oversight?" The judge's voice could have frozen water. "Or a deliberate omission." John Collins suddenly shoved past his lawyer, his face purple with rage. "That little witch, she's trying to steal what's rightfully mine." Two deputies moved quickly to restrain him as he lunged toward Mary Beth. She stood her ground, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Remove Mr. Collins from my courtroom," Judge Harrison ordered. As her stepfather was dragged away cursing, the judge turned his stern gaze on the railroad agent. "Mr. Porter, I strongly suggest you remain available for questioning about these apparently forged documents." The agent nodded shakily and slunk toward the back of the room. Judge Harrison squared the papers on his desk with precise movements. The sound seemed to echo in the tense silence. "Based on the evidence presented, I find the charges against Tiago Boone to be false and malicious. He is to be released immediately." The gavel struck with finality. "Furthermore, I am ordering an investigation into these suspicious land claims. Mr. Porter and Mr. Collins will both answer for what appears to be a conspiracy to defraud rightful property owners." The deputies moved to unlock Tiago's chains. Mary Beth's legs felt weak with relief as she watched them fall away. When Tiago stood, rubbing his wrists, his eyes found hers across the room. The love and pride in his gaze made her heart swell. The courtroom erupted in conversation as people began to move. Several townspeople approached Mary Beth, offering quiet congratulations or awkward apologies for their earlier judgment. The preacher's wife pressed her hand warmly, whispering, "Well done, dear heart." Henry touched Mary Beth's shoulder gently. "You stood strong, like the mountains themselves. Your mother would be proud." Before she could respond, Tiago reached them. Without hesitation, he gathered Mary Beth into his arms, holding her close. She pressed her face against his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather, finally letting her tears fall. "My brave wife, he murmured against her hair. My real wife, if you'll have me true. Mary Beth looked up at him through tear-blurred eyes, seeing all their shared future in his gentle smile. Around them, the courtroom continued to buzz with excitement, but they stood in their own quiet moment of triumph and love. The winter sunlight poured through the windows, turning Mary Beth's tears to diamonds as justice and truth prevailed in the small mountain town courthouse. The memory of her shame in the street had been washed away, replaced by the power of her courage and the strength of the love that had grown from desperate pretense into deepest truth. The heavy iron door creaked open, and Tiago stepped out of the cell. His eyes found Mary Beth immediately, like a compass finding true north. She rushed forward, tears streaming down her face, and threw herself into his waiting arms. He held her close, burying his face in her hair as she sobbed against his chest. I thought I'd lost you, she whispered, her fingers clutching his worn shirt. The townspeople who had gathered in the jail's anteroom lowered their heads, shame clear on their faces. Many of them had laughed at Mary Beth that first day, but now they witnessed the depth of love that had grown between these two souls. Sheriff Grady cleared his throat awkwardly. Mr. Boone, I'm mighty sorry for this whole mess. Should have known better than to trust Collins. The moon hung bright and full as their wagon creaked homeward through the silent night. Snow blanketed the mountain peaks, glowing silver in the starlight. The steady clip-clop of the horses' hooves marked their journey while frost crystallized on the wagon's wooden sides. Mary Beth nestled closer to Tiago's side, sharing his warmth. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. He wrapped his arm tighter around her shoulders. No more pretending. What lay between them now was real and true as the stars above. The deep mountain winter settled around the cabin like a thick blanket. Each morning, Tiago's boots crunched through fresh snow as he made his way to the spring. Mary Beth's spring now. Thanks to her mother's foresight, the clear water bubbled up through rocks, never freezing despite the cold. He would pause sometimes, watching the steam rise off the surface, grateful for this blessing that had come with her. Inside the cabin, Mary Beth moved with growing confidence. Her hands worked dough with practiced ease, kneading and shaping loaves that filled their home with the scent of fresh bread. The shame that once haunted her eyes had begun to fade, replaced by quiet contentment. When she smiled now, it reached all the way to her eyes. Smells mighty fine in here, Tiago would say, stamping snow from his boots by the door. Her answering smile warmed him more than the crackling fire ever could. Every few days, they discovered small packages on their porch gifts from townsfolk who had once turned cruel faces their way. A bolt of calico fabric appeared one morning, wrapped in brown paper. The next week brought a small sack of precious white sugar. Widow Jensen sent over a stack of split firewood with her sons, who touched their hat brims respectfully to Mary Beth. In the evenings, they settled into the rhythm of true marriage. Tiago would whittle by lamplight while Mary Beth mended or read from her mother's Bible. Sometimes a memory would strike one of them funny, like the time Tiago's horse had gotten spooked by a rabbit, and their laughter would fill the cabin's warm air. Never thought I'd have this, Tiago admitted one night, watching her stir the stew pot. A real home. Mary Beth paused, wooden spoon in hand. Nor did I, she said softly, but the Lord works in mysterious ways. The fire popped and crackled in response, sending sparks up the chimney. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside their cabin, something stronger than winter had taken root: trust, acceptance, and the quiet certainty of belonging. Sunday dawned bright and cold, the sun glinting off fresh snow. Tiago hitched the horses to their wagon while Mary Beth adjusted her newly sewn dress, made from the townspeople's gifted fabric. The drive to church was peaceful, their breaths making little clouds in the crisp morning air. The small white church stood welcoming against the mountain backdrop, smoke curling from its chimney. As Tiago helped Mary Beth down from the wagon, she noticed the difference immediately. Gone were the suspicious glances and cruel whispers. Instead, Mrs. Jensen waved warmly, and the blacksmith's wife hurried over to compliment her dress. Inside, the pot-bellied stove radiated heat as the congregation settled into their wooden pews. Sunlight streamed through frosted windows, casting rainbow patterns across the wooden floor. When Preacher Thomas called them forward for a blessing, Tiago's strong hand steadied Mary Beth's elbow as they walked to the front. "We gather today to bless this union," the preacher began, his Bible open before him. But Tiago cleared his throat, interrupting softly. "Begging your pardon, preacher, but there's something I need to say first." The congregation hushed as Tiago turned to face Marybeth. His weathered face was solemn as he took her hands in his. Then, to everyone's amazement, this proud mountain man lowered himself to one knee. "Marybeth," he said, his deep voice carrying clearly through the silent church. "I started this by pretending, but there ain't nothing pretend about what I feel now." His hands tightened gently around hers. "You brought light to my dark cabin and warmth to my lonely days. Will you marry me? Truly, for all our days to come?" Tears spilled down Marybeth's cheeks as she gazed at this man who had first saved her dignity and then her heart. "Yes," she whispered, then louder. "Yes." The moment her answer rang out, Mrs. Jensen's voice lifted in amazing grace. One by one, the entire congregation joined in, their joyful voices filling the little church with song. Tiago stood, gathering Marybeth close as the hymn soared around them, a blessing more powerful than any formal words could convey. In that moment, surrounded by the same townspeople who had once mocked her, Marybeth felt the full circle of God's grace. What had begun in shame now glowed with redemption, wrapped in the sweet notes of sacred song and the strong arms of true love. The following week brought a day of pristine winter beauty. Inside the church, women bustled about, hanging evergreen boughs and setting oil lamps in the windows. The simple sanctuary glowed with warmth and welcome, so different from that first Sunday when Marybeth had trembled at its threshold. Mrs. Jensen and the other church women had worked through evenings to create Marybeth's wedding dress. Though modest, the cream-colored cotton was beautifully embroidered, with tiny flowers along the collar and cuffs. When Marybeth emerged from the back room wearing it, the preacher's wife dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. At the front of the church, Tiago stood tall in his best shirt, freshly pressed. Henry Tall Elk stood proudly at his side as witness, his usually stern face softened with rare emotion. He had gifted the couple with a blanket woven in sacred patterns, a blessing from his people. As Marybeth walked down the aisle, lamplight from the frosted windows cast a golden glow across the wooden floors. Tiago's eyes never left her face, seeing not just the woman before him but the courage that had brought them both to this moment. Their vows rang clear in the hushed sanctuary. Tiago's deep voice steadied as he promised to cherish and protect. Marybeth's words, though softer, carried the strength of complete certainty. When the preacher pronounced them truly husband and wife, the congregation's joy erupted in heartfelt amens. The celebration afterward filled the church hall with warmth and laughter. Women brought their best cooking, thick venison stew, fresh bread, and pies of every kind. Children darted between tables while Henry shared stories of Tiago's early days in the mountains, making everyone chuckle. As evening approached, Tiago helped his bride into their wagon. The town gathered to wave farewell, showering them with good wishes and God's blessings. Stars began appearing in the crystal-clear sky as they drove home. Marybeth snuggled close against the cold. Their cabin welcomed them with golden lamplight through the windows. Inside, the hearth crackled with fresh-laid fire. Without speaking, they knelt together beside its warmth. Marybeth's hands found Tiago's as they bowed their heads in prayer, thanking God for his mercy that had turned shame to dignity, loneliness to love, and two separate lives into one family. The flames danced quietly as their whispered "Amen" sealed the moment. Marybeth, once clothed in humiliation, now wore the mantle of honor as a beloved wife. Tiago, who had known only solitude, now held the greatest treasure of his life. Together, they had found their way home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.